German situation map. Russian front at the beginning of Case Blue, June 28, 1942. The German summer offensive did not target Moscow as expected by the Soviet High Command. From the Baltics to northern Ukraine, only limited operations were to take place. The main axis of attack was south toward the Caucasus and the Volga. June 22, 1942. A year has passed since the German invasion of the USSR. For the Soviet people, this single year seemed like 10. There had been the disaster at the borders, with terrible losses in men and materiel, followed by a chaotic retreat and a series of disorganized Red Army counterstrikes against the Wehrmacht, which advanced at speed along three main axes on a 3,000-kilometre front. There was the evacuation of countless refugees and of whole industries. There was the first great defensive battle around Smolensk. There were the giant encirclements of Kiev, Bryansk, Vyazma, and the loss of immense territory. There was a dramatic siege of Leningrad, the dreadful winter of 1941, and the desperate defences at the gates of Moscow. But there were also the first major setbacks for the German command. Leningrad held, and the Wehrmacht was driven back from the Moscow region. Operations Barbarossa and Typhoon failed short of their objectives. The spring of 1942 passed without any decisive achievements on either side. As the war in the east entered its second summer, the German High Command finalized preparations for its next great offensive, codenamed Fall Blau. Although not a primary target at first, the city on the Volga, which bore Stalin's name, was to become increasingly significant for both sides. The campaign for Stalingrad began a long way from and well before the fighting in the city itself began. After the dramatic German advance through Ukraine in summer, Hitler was so confident that he decided to alter Operation Blau in order to pursue two objectives at the same time: the Caucasus, with its petroleum fields, and Stalingrad, key to the Volga, which could secure the whole southern front in this region. Since mid-July 1942, the approaches of the Don, 100 kilometres away from the city, had been the theatre of incessant and costly battles for both sides. July 17 is the official date for the beginning of the battle. At this moment, the 6th Army was about 380,000 strong. The Stalingrad Front, created 5 days earlier, could only oppose the German advance with relatively few forces at first. These consisted of 3 reserve armies, the 62nd, 63rd and 64th, and the depleted 21st Army. The rest of the front's forces were still assembling. Incomplete units were rushed to the battlefield piecemeal. When all its forces arrived 3 weeks later, the Stalingrad front was eventually 350,000 strong, but for now it was only about 250,000. On July 23, the first strategically important engagement developed in the Don River bend, 100 kilometres away from the city. It was not only the first, but also the greatest tank battle in the entire campaign of 1942, with 300 tanks on the German side and twice this number on the Soviet side. About 1/3 of the total German forces and about half of the Soviet forces were taking part in this major and often forgotten fighting in the Don Bend at the end of July. In early August, the Germans gained a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Don, yet Paulus needed 3 more weeks to enlarge it sufficiently and to regroup his forces for the final jump to Stalingrad. The steppe was littered with wreckage of Soviet armoured formations thrown against 6th Army, whose advance seemed as inexorable as it had in 1941, when the panzers were rushing towards Moscow. In late August, the Wehrmacht broke through the Red Army defences on the Don. 14th Panzer Corps' most mobile elements drove directly to the Volga, ripping the front in two and establishing a long-lasting corridor through the Kotlebane region. The afternoon of the 23rd, when forward units reached the Volga on the high ground near the northern suburbs, they could see from the distance a blazing city that had been and was being bombed to ruins by the Luftwaffe. At the beginning of September, after nearly 2 months of exhaustive progress on the Don Bend, 6th Army's and 4th Army's main forces were finally closing on the city. However, they failed to entrap the withdrawing 62nd and 64th Armies, which had by this time achieved a heroic deed. They had restrained the advance of German troops on the steppe for a much longer period than first anticipated by Paulus and Weichs. But the price in Soviet casualties was appalling. The remnant units that entrenched themselves in the city's outskirts on the eve of the street fighting were only shadows of themselves, with numerous formations reduced to 10% of their former effectiveness, totally spent and lacking supplies and ammunition. On 12 September, when General Chuikov arrived at 62nd Army's headquarters on Mamayev Kurgan to take command, the picture was sinister. The army, isolated from the rest of the Soviet forces, had to carry out the dreadful task of defending Stalingrad with less than 55,000 men clinging to its ruins. The nearest neighbour outside the German ring, Shumilov's 64th Army, was also down to a handful of weak units hanging on to the southern suburbs. The night was short. The following day, at first light, the battle for the city began with a deafening roar.
Together with Brad, we are working on a new series of videos dedicated to the fighting inside the city, which will heavily rely on archival data, German as well as Soviet, so we'll make extensive use of wartime documents in order to provide the maximum level of detail and accuracy. We hope that this can maybe be used as a reference for TIC's own videos as well.
Extracts from original sources. The Wehrmacht documents. From the 6th Army Diary on 13 September 1942. Weather: clear, sunny. Command post at Godlubinka. Incorporated into the Army 1 Luftwaffe Field Regiment, Group Stahl, subordinated to 51st Army Corps. Morning report of the Army. Except for artillery shelling and actions of reconnaissance groups, the night passed calmly. 51st Army Corps went on the offensive at 0445 hours, according to plan. In the sector of 11th Army Corps, the attack by an enemy battalion against the left flank of the 44th Infantry Division at dawn was repelled. No incidents in other sectors. The commander took part in meetings with the Führer. The Führer approved Decision 2. The Army is ordered to use the left flank of 17th Army Corps for a quick settlement of the situation on the southern bank of the Don, and to use these forces to strike north between the Volga and the Don. Interim Summary for the Army. To the west of Stalingrad, 51st Army Corps achieved a deep breakthrough of the enemy's defence and, overcoming the very tough resistance of the enemy, with especially strong artillery, occupied the dominant heights northwest of the city centre and the barracks there. The Corps reached its objective of the day: 23 enemy tanks destroyed. 51st Army Corps is fighting despite a lack of ammunition for assault guns and heavy mortars, which the Army has not received. No fighting in other sectors. In particular, 51st Army Corps committed the 71st and the 295th Infantry Divisions to attack in narrow wedges the enemy fortifications west of Stalingrad along the Tartar Wall. The Russians resisted extremely stubbornly. Bringing up new forces and with especially strong support of artillery and mortars, they fought to the last man in well-prepared and fortified positions. In the heavy struggle at the Tartar Wall, the high ground of the barracks was captured before noon, and several Russian counterattacks were repelled. The 389th Infantry Division went on to the offensive, covering the eastern flank of the attacking wedges, took the railway line 3.5 kilometers southeast of Godadish and 1.5 kilometers south of Razgulyevka station, fighting with a stubbornly defending opponent. Several weak attacks against the northern front of 14th Tank Corps were repelled. No incidents in 11 and 17 Army Corps sectors. Between 21:45 and 23:20 hours, final daily summary of the Army. 51st Army Corps, despite considerable enemy resistance, achieved local improvements to its position. In the evening, Russian artillery bombardments and raids by ground attack aircraft and bombers intensified. The number of enemy tanks destroyed today reached 29. In the afternoon, 13 Russian tanks attacked 17 Army Corps' eastern flank, south of Yakovsky, in 1st Romanian Cavalry Division sector. In the evening, 3 Russian tanks advanced on Logovsky and broke through our line of defence. With the engagement of 22nd Panzer Grenadiers Brigade's replacement units, 2 tanks were destroyed and the situation was restored. Otherwise, no changes regarding the interim summary. 8th Air Corps supported the offensive by 51st Army Corps with strong forces. Significant enemy aircraft activity in the evening with heavy airstrikes on 51st Army Corps. Report of the Chief Quartermaster on shortage of ammunition received. 51st Army Corps. At night, artillery and mortar shelling, as well as numerous bomber raids on the whole front. At 04:45 hours, the Corps, according to plan, went on to the offensive. At 10:30 hours, 71st Infantry Division continued to advance. On the right flank and in the centre of the division, the enemy remains in the same positions. By 1100 hours, 295th Infantry Division reached the flying school and the airfield, with Infantry Regiment 518 and the ravine 300 miles north of the road, with Infantry Regiment 517. 14 T-34s and 1 KV-1 were destroyed. The 389th Infantry Division took Razgulyevka and advanced to the railway station with Infantry Regiment 546. In other sectors, it was not possible to overcome the strong and well-fortified defence of the enemy along the railway embankment. Here, 12 T-34s were destroyed. In the evening, the Corps moved to the defence on occupied positions. Heavy shelling and air raids with incendiary and fragmentation bombs were directed on them.
So here returns the Star Data channel and Antiques channel.